Hello! So, I told the sob story about AMD's last Halo from the competitive era in my last video. To sum up, NVIDIA held the lead with the GTX 780 Ti, became dominant with the 900 series GPUs, and then extended its lead with the 10 series Pascal GPUs. The first Pascal GPUs became immediately popular because the performance jump was big enough that the GTX 1060 was competitive with the previous generation GTX 980. But it was a year after the launch of Pascal when one of the most celebrated graphics cards of recent times was released, the GTX 1080 Ti, which I'll be testing on my Linux system. Again, I'll be using my Ryzen 5 3600 system with 16GB of DDR4 3600 RAM, and I'll be using Ubuntu 24.04 LTS, because no, I don't want to deal with bugs because I'm not a weirdo. Ah, what a beautiful day. The only thing that could make it better is if I spent today Googling why there's no video output from my graphics card anymore. This truly is living. This graphics card can only use the NVIDIA 580 drivers and older, so I used the 580 drivers. I'm testing on 1080p so that we can directly compare performance with the cards I've tested previously, of which there are only two. Look, it'll be useful later on. Starting off with Dota 2, we don't really see much of a performance difference with the cards I've already tested. This is a CPU-bound game. While the GTX 1080 Ti is slightly faster, it's only by less than 1% over the R9 290X, and just over 4% over the GTX 1650. Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition is pretty much the same. The GTX 1080 Ti is about 1% faster than the R9 290X, and 3% faster than the GTX 1650. Counter-Strike 2 is where the differences really start to show. The GTX 1080 Ti generated 33% more frames per second than the GTX 1650, and 147% more frames per second than the R9 290X, which doesn't do well on this game. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a much more GPU-bound game, lets the GTX 1080 Ti really stretch its legs, with more than double the frames per second generated over the other two cards, a 111% gain over the R9 290X, and a 145% gain over the GTX 1650. Cyberpunk 2077 also showed gains for the GTX 1080 Ti, though not as much as for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 40% more frames per second than the R9 290X, and 72% more than the GTX 1650. Overall, the GTX 1080 Ti, even including the Dota and Age of Empires results, generated 40% more frames per second than the R9 290X, and 36% more than the GTX 1650. You know, it's funny looking back on this. When it launched, there were, of course, positive reviews as it outperformed the Titan X Pascal at a much lower price, but there wasn't the sort of hype you might have expected given the love this card gets now. I read reviews at the time, but without much interest because it was still a very expensive Halo card that I would never own. But I do own it now. Dreams do come true. What made this card really, to paraphrase a great poet, shine bright like a diamond, was the pretty lukewarm Turing, that is, the RTX 20 series, that followed, and then the crypto mining boom. Thatcher's legacy lives on. That pushed prices to absurdity and meant no one really had a chance to own the newer Ampere graphics cards anyway. On top of that, NVIDIA themselves pushed the GTX 1080 Ti status even higher by not pairing its subsequent Ada Lovelace and Blackwell GPUs with enough VRAM to make sure AI developers bought their more expensive workstation cards, so even now 11GB of VRAM looks like a lot. So, should you buy one today? Well, it depends on the price you find one, and GTX 1080 Ti prices seem to vary especially wildly, but overall I think it's a good buy. The later RTX cards command a bit of a price premium, and from what I've seen, GTX 1080 Ti's go for roughly the same prices as used RTX 2070s, which are close in performance but a bit slower. On the other hand, while no contemporaneous AMD could hold a candle to the GTX 1080 Ti, it does compete now on the used market with the RX 6600 XT, which uses less power and supports ray tracing. Just. The GTX 1080 Ti, though, has that bigger memory buffer, and is still a perfectly useful gaming card, which is a shocking thing to say about a card launched 9 years ago. Well, maybe it's not that shocking, everyone already knows it's awesome.